Most people believe they know the story of Little Red Riding Hood, a naive girl, a dangerous wolf. A clear lesson: obey your parents, beware of strangers, and everything will be fine. But this story, in this form, is not ancient. It is not timeless, and it is not the version people once told. The tale most readers recognize today exists because, at a specific moment in European history, two scholars decided that the original story was too uncomfortable to remain as it was. Those scholars were Brothers Grimm. When Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published the first volume of Kinder- und Hausmärchen in 1812, they were not writing children's literature. They were collecting oral folklore, stories passed down by word of mouth, often told among adults, shaped by fear, hunger, sexuality, and social control. These tales were not designed to comfort. They were designed to warn. One of those stories was Rotkäppchen. In the earliest known European versions of the tale, including Charles Perrault's French version from 1697, there is no rescue. The wolf deceives the girl, she undresses, gets into bed, and is eaten. The story ends there. No hunter, no salvation, no second chance. Perrault was explicit about the moral. Young girls who ignore warnings and trust strangers will suffer the consequences. The tale functioned as a cautionary narrative about sexuality, danger, and social boundaries. It was meant to unsettle. By the time the Brothers Grimm encountered the story in the early 19th century, Germany was not just collecting folklore. It was building a national identity. The Napoleonic Wars had fractured the German lands politically and psychologically. Intellectuals believed culture could do what borders could not: unite people through a shared past. Folklore became a serious project. The Grimms were part of this movement. They believed that fairy tales contained the authentic voice of the German people. But they also believed that these stories needed to be preserved in a form suitable for families, education, and moral instruction. That belief required changes. In the 1812 edition of Little Red Riding Hood, the Grimm brothers already began to soften the story. By the 1819 edition, the transformation was unmistakable. A hunter was introduced. The girl and her grandmother were rescued. The wolf was punished. Order was restored. But the changes went deeper than the ending. The girl was no longer simply deceived. She was explicitly disobedient. She was warned by her mother not to stray from the path, and she chose to do so anyway. Her mistake became the center of the story. The danger was no longer random or tragic. It was deserved. This was not accidental. The Brothers Grimm were responding to social pressure, pedagogical concerns, and the expectations of a growing middle-class readership. Fairy tales were increasingly read by children. Publishers, educators, and parents demanded stories that reinforced discipline, obedience, and moral clarity. Ambiguity had to go. Sexual subtext was removed. Violence was reframed as justice. Authority figures, like the hunter, were introduced as protectors of social order. The forest remained dangerous, but only for those who broke the rules. In other words, Little Red Riding Hood stopped being a warning about the world and became a lesson about behavior. This shift mattered, because once a story is reshaped for children, it stops being just a reflection of fear. It becomes a tool for teaching norms: who is safe, who is dangerous, and why punishment happens. The Grimms did not invent this logic, but they helped standardize it. Their versions became definitive. They were printed, reprinted, translated, illustrated, and taught. By the late 19th century, alternative versions of Little Red Riding Hood, versions without rescue, without moral certainty, had largely disappeared from popular memory. What survived was a single narrative, repeated so often it felt ancient. Good child, bad wolf, clear rules. By the early 20th century, these fairy tales were no longer just stories. They were cultural foundations. They shaped how danger was imagined, how obedience was rewarded, and how deviation was punished, all before a child learned to read political texts or understand ideology. That is why, a century later, they would attract the attention of people who understood the power of culture very well. Not because the stories were invented by them, but because the stories had already been disciplined. Little Red Riding Hood had been transformed from a disturbing folktale into a moral blueprint. The wolf was no longer complex or ambiguous. He was simply evil. The child was no longer unlucky. She was at fault. Order triumphed only when authority intervened. These patterns were not political, but they were useful. And once a story is useful, it can be repurposed. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the Nazis, not with propaganda, but with a decision made long before 1933, a decision about what kind of stories children should hear and what kind should be quietly left behind. Because when later regimes looked at fairy tales, they did not see fiction. They saw structure. And structure, once established, can be used by anyone who understands how stories teach people what feels normal, especially to children. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, the country did not immediately resemble a dictatorship. The Constitution was still in place. Courts still functioned. Newspapers were still printed. Many Germans believed they were witnessing yet another fragile coalition government in a republic already accustomed to crisis. What changed first was not the law. It was the tone. The National Socialist movement understood something its opponents underestimated. Power did not begin with control over institutions. It began with control over meaning. Before a society accepts new rules, it must accept a new understanding of itself. Who belongs? Who threatens that belonging? And what kind of future feels natural? That is why culture mattered more than legislation. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation exhausted by instability. The trauma of the First World War, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation in 1923, mass unemployment after the 1929 crash, all of it had created a population desperate not just for solutions, but for coherence. People did not only want jobs or order, they wanted explanations. Stories that made suffering feel purposeful and decline feel temporary. The Nazi movement offered exactly that. It did not initially speak the language of extermination or total war. It spoke the language of rebirth, renewal, and destiny. Its vision was not framed as revolution, but as restoration. Germany returning to what it was meant to be before corruption, weakness, and foreign influence distorted it. To make that claim believable, the regime needed more than police power. It needed cultural authority. From the beginning, the Nazis understood that a population can obey laws without believing in them. But belief creates something far stronger than obedience. Belief creates participation, and belief is formed long before adulthood. That is why childhood became a strategic priority. By the spring of 1933, the process known as Gleichschaltung, coordination, was underway. Political parties were dissolved. Trade unions were dismantled. Independent organizations were absorbed into Nazi-controlled structures. But alongside these visible changes ran a quieter transformation, aimed not at voters or workers, but at families and schools. Education was rapidly centralized under the Reich Ministry of Education. Teachers were required to demonstrate ideological reliability. Textbooks were revised. Youth organizations were reorganized, eventually culminating in compulsory membership in the Hitler Youth by 1936. Yet even these measures were not enough. The regime did not want children who merely followed rules. It wanted children who felt the rules were right. This required something more intimate than propaganda posters or speeches. It required access to the emotional architecture of childhood. Stories, symbols, archetypes. It required culture. Unlike modern authoritarian regimes that rely heavily on explicit messaging, the Nazi leadership believed that overt ideology was crude. Effective indoctrination, in their view, worked best when it appeared apolitical, when it felt inherited, rather than imposed. This belief had roots in German intellectual history long before 1933. 19th-century thinkers had argued that a nation's true essence lived not in parliaments or laws, but in language, myth, and folklore. Stories passed down through generations were believed to encode collective values more authentically than any written constitution. The Nazis did not invent this idea. They radicalized it. Under National Socialism, culture was no longer something a society produced organically. It was something to be curated, purified, and directed. The regime treated cultural material as a biological resource, capable of contamination, degeneration, or strengthening, depending on how it was handled. In this worldview, fairy tales were not trivial. They were foundational. Fairy tales occupied a unique position in German society. They were familiar, emotionally trusted, and widely shared across class lines. Unlike political texts, they were rarely questioned. Unlike religious doctrine, they could be adapted without theological debate. And unlike modern literature, they carried the aura of age, of having existed forever. This made them ideal vehicles for transmitting norms. A fairy tale does not tell a child what to think. It teaches the child what feels right, who deserves sympathy, who deserves punishment, what happens when rules are followed, and when they are broken. By the early 20th century, the most authoritative versions of these stories came from the collections of the brothers Grimm. Their editions were taught in schools, printed in affordable formats, and presented as authentic expressions of German heritage. By 1933, Grimm fairy tales were not just literature, they were cultural facts. The Nazi leadership recognized this immediately. Rather than replacing these stories, they embraced them. Rather than questioning their authority, they amplified it. Grimm fairy tales were presented as proof that German values were ancient, natural, and self-evident. The regime did not argue for its worldview. It embedded it. This approach aligned perfectly with the Nazi conception of race and destiny. According to their ideology, history was not a sequence of choices, but a biological struggle. People did not become what they were through circumstance or education. They revealed what they already were through blood. Fairy tales, with their emphasis on fate, inheritance, and moral consequence, fit seamlessly into this framework. They depicted worlds where character was revealed through action, where deviation from norms led to disaster, and where order was restored through decisive intervention. These were not political messages, but they were politically useful. A child raised on such narratives would not need to be told that obedience was virtuous. It would already feel obvious. The idea that danger came from outside the community, that purity required vigilance, and that punishment was a form of justice would feel intuitive rather than imposed. This was ideological preparation without explicit ideology. Importantly, the regime did not rely solely on civilian cultural institutions. Within the SS, cultural research was elevated to a matter of state security. The leadership of the SS believed that Germany's future depended on recovering and safeguarding what they considered its original spiritual and cultural foundations. This belief would later take institutional form in organizations dedicated to researching folklore, language, archaeology, and mythology. These efforts were framed as scientific, objective, and restorative. Culture was treated not as a living process, but as a relic that had to be excavated and protected from distortion. In this context, fairy tales were no longer neutral stories. They were evidence of what Germans were supposed to be. The most striking aspect of this cultural strategy is how little resistance it encountered. Parents continued reading familiar stories. Teachers continued using trusted materials. Publishers continued printing books that looked identical to earlier editions. Nothing appeared to have changed. That was precisely the point. The regime understood that sudden cultural rupture provokes suspicion. Continuity creates comfort. By presenting its worldview as a continuation of inherited tradition, National Socialism avoided appearing radical. It framed itself as the guardian of what had always existed. Children growing up in the 1930s did not experience indoctrination as coercion. They experienced it as education, as tradition, as common sense. By the time they were old enough to encounter explicit political doctrine, its emotional groundwork had already been laid. This strategy explains why the Nazi leadership invested so heavily in youth, long before the outbreak of war. It explains why stories, songs, and rituals mattered as much as military drills. And it explains why cultural material was treated with the same seriousness as economic or military planning. A society prepared through culture does not require constant enforcement. It enforces itself. By the late 1930s, Germany had produced a generation for whom hierarchy felt natural, exclusion felt justified, and violence felt orderly when framed as necessity. These attitudes were not learned in political lectures. They were absorbed gradually, quietly, through repetition, often through stories told before sleep. By 1933, the brothers Grimm were no longer read as authors. They were read as origins. Their names did not evoke individual biographies or scholarly debates. They evoked something older and heavier: inheritance. For generations of Germans, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm represented a point where the modern world seemed to touch an ancient one. Their fairy tales were not perceived as literature in the ordinary sense, but as fragments of a deeper past, something collected rather than created. This perception mattered more than the stories themselves. When the National Socialists came to power, they did not encounter the Grimm canon as a flexible body of texts open to discussion. They encountered it as cultural fact. The fairy tales had already been canonized through decades of school curricula, family reading, and publishing practice. By the early 20th century, Grimm stories functioned less as narratives and more as reference points, shared material that did not need to be explained or defended. For a regime obsessed with continuity and legitimacy, this was invaluable. Rather than rewriting the Grimms, the Nazi leadership chose a different strategy: appropriation through interpretation. The fairy tales were presented not as products of a particular historical moment, but as direct expressions of the German people's eternal character. The Grimms were framed as men who had simply uncovered what had always existed. This framing was repeated across cultural policy, educational guidance, and ideological commentary throughout the 1930s. The implication was clear. National Socialism was not inventing a new worldview. It was completing an old one. In official discourse, the brothers Grimm were increasingly associated with concepts central to Nazi ideology: Volk, rootedness, blood continuity, and the organic unity of the community. Their focus on oral tradition and rural storytelling was used to contrast authentic German culture with what the regime defined as artificial, urban, and foreign. The fact that the Grimms were 19th-century scholars working within European Romanticism was largely irrelevant to this narrative. Their academic context was stripped away. Their work was detached from philology, linguistics, and historical method and repositioned as cultural instinct. The fairy tales were no longer treated as edited collections. They were treated as evidence. This shift was subtle but decisive. Once the stories were framed as direct reflections of ancient German values, they could be mobilized without appearing ideological. They did not argue, they revealed. In this way, the Grimms were transformed into cultural ancestors, rather than authors, figures whose authority could not be questioned without questioning German identity itself. This transformation had immediate consequences for education. Throughout the 1930s, Grimm fairy tales remained firmly embedded in school reading materials. They were presented as suitable texts for moral instruction, character formation, and cultural grounding. Teachers were encouraged to treat them not as imaginative fiction, but as lessons in order, responsibility, and consequence. What mattered was not the narrative complexity of the stories, but the patterns they reinforced. Disobedience led to danger. Order was restored through intervention. The community survived because rules were enforced. These themes were not new, but under the Third Reich, they were no longer neutral. Within the classroom, fairy tales functioned as pre-political education. They taught children how to interpret the world before ideology was ever named. Authority appeared protective rather than coercive. Punishment appeared necessary rather than cruel. Belonging appeared conditional rather than universal. Because these lessons were embedded in familiar stories, they were rarely perceived as instruction. They felt natural. The regime's cultural apparatus consistently emphasized that fairy tales should not be modernized or psychologically reinterpreted. Such approaches were dismissed as distortions. Instead, the preferred reading presented Grimm stories as simple, direct expressions of moral truth. This insistence on simplicity was itself ideological. Ambiguity complicates authority. Complexity invites interpretation. Interpretation invites doubt. The Nazi use of Grimm fairy tales favored clarity over nuance, inevitability over chance, and punishment over mercy. Stories that supported these structures were highlighted. Others faded into the background. This was not a matter of banning texts. It was a matter of selection. The Grimm canon was treated as fixed, but the emphasis within it was not. The symbolic value of the Grimms extended beyond schools and into the broader cultural narrative of the regime. In essays, lectures, and publications, their work was repeatedly cited as proof that German values predated liberalism, democracy, and modern political thought. The message was consistent. Germany did not need new ideas. It needed to return to its own. In this context, fairy tales became tools of historical compression. They collapsed centuries of social change into a single, imagined continuity. The past appeared unified, orderly, and stable, an inheritance disrupted only by foreign influence and internal weakness. This imagined past served a clear political function. It allowed National Socialism to present itself, not as a radical break, but as a restoration of balance. The Grimm stories helped make this claim emotionally convincing, not because they said it directly, but because they made it feel familiar. The effectiveness of this strategy lay in what it did not require. There was no need to rewrite fairy tales wholesale, no need to introduce overt racial doctrine into children's stories, no need to mark the texts as ideological. The authority of the Grimms did the work. Their names signaled legitimacy. Their stories carried trust. Their cultural status shielded the process from scrutiny. A child listening to Little Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel was not encountering propaganda. The story did not demand belief, it assumed it. And assumptions, once internalized, are more powerful than arguments. As the decade progressed, this cultural framework aligned seamlessly with the broader Nazi project. The regime sought to produce individuals who did not merely obey, but understood obedience as virtue, who did not merely exclude, but perceived exclusion as order, who did not merely accept punishment, but recognized it as justice. Fairy tales helped normalize these perceptions long before political language was introduced. By the time explicit ideology appeared, in youth organizations, military training, and public life, the emotional groundwork had already been laid. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. The brothers Grimm did not design their work for this purpose. But once their fairy tales were canonized, standardized, and stripped of historical context, they became available for use in ways their authors never controlled. Cultural authority, once established, does not remain neutral. It can be claimed. It can be redirected. And under the Third Reich it was. By presenting Grimm fairy tales as timeless expressions of German character, the Nazi regime embedded its worldview in the most trusted narratives of childhood. The stories themselves did not change dramatically. Their meaning did. They ceased to be one version among many. They became the version. And once that happened, they no longer belonged to literature alone. They belonged to power. By the late 1930s, fairy tales in Nazi Germany were no longer just cultural inheritance. They had become objects of management. This shift did not occur in public classrooms or publishing houses alone. It took place inside the institutional world of the SS, where culture was treated not as expression, but as infrastructure. For the leadership of the SS, folklore was not entertainment and not nostalgia. It was raw material, something that could be studied, categorized, purified, and deployed. At the center of this effort stood Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's worldview was not limited to police power or military discipline. He believed that the future of Germany depended on recovering what he called the inner substance of the German people. This substance, he argued, had been damaged by Christianity, liberalism, and foreign cultural influence. To rebuild it, the SS would have to look beyond politics and into the past. Not the historical past as understood by historians, but an imagined ancestral past reconstructed through selective evidence. This belief led directly to the creation of one of the most unusual institutions of the Third Reich, Ahnenerbe. Founded in 1935, the Ahnenerbe, officially the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, was presented as a scholarly organization dedicated to researching Germanic history, culture, and origins. In practice, it functioned as an ideological laboratory under SS control. Its mandate was broad. It covered archaeology, linguistics, mythology, folklore, ethnography, and ritual. Anything that could be framed as evidence of ancient German greatness fell within its scope. Fairy tales were no exception. Within the worldview of the SS, folklore occupied a privileged position. Unlike written history, it was believed to predate institutions and laws. Unlike religion, it could be separated from Christian doctrine. Unlike modern literature, it appeared untainted by contemporary politics. Folklore, in this logic, was biological memory. This assumption justified SS involvement in cultural research. If fairy tales encoded ancestral truths, then studying them was not an academic exercise. It was a matter of racial preservation. Under Ahnenerbe supervision, folklore was approached systematically. Stories were collected, compared, and classified. Motifs were analyzed not for narrative meaning, but for ideological compatibility. Elements that aligned with the SS worldview were treated as authentic survivals. Others were dismissed as later distortions. The goal was not discovery. The goal was confirmation. One of the Ahnenerbe's core assumptions was that Germanic culture had once been unified, pure, and coherent, and that its fragmentation was the result of foreign contamination. Folklore research was therefore framed as a process of recovery rather than interpretation. This approach had direct implications for fairy tales associated with the Brothers Grimm. The Grimm canon was treated as a starting point, not an endpoint. SS researchers assumed that even these already edited stories still contained traces of an older, more authentic worldview. Their task was to isolate those traces and emphasize them. Motifs that supported hierarchy, bloodline, obedience, and exclusion were highlighted. Motifs that suggested ambiguity, mercy, or social mobility were downplayed or reinterpreted. For example, tales in which authority figures restore order through decisive action were framed as evidence of natural leadership. Stories where punishment follows disobedience were cited as proof that moral law is absolute. Forests were interpreted as ancestral spaces, dangerous, sacred, and requiring vigilance. These readings were presented as objective analysis. They were not. They were ideological extraction. The involvement of the SS marked a decisive change in how fairy tales functioned within the Nazi system. What had previously been a matter of education and publishing now became a matter of research policy. Folklore was no longer just taught. It was studied under SS supervision. This distinction mattered. Education can be decentralized. Research, when centralized, produces authority. The Ahnenerbe did not simply influence how fairy tales were read. It influenced which interpretations were considered legitimate. Once an interpretation received the approval of an SS research body, it gained weight far beyond the classroom. It could be cited in educational guidance, cultural essays, and ideological training materials. It carried the implied authority of science. That authority insulated the process from criticism. Importantly, the SS did not need to alter the text of fairy tales dramatically to achieve this effect. The existing canon, already standardized through decades of publication, was sufficient. What changed was the framework. A story about danger became a story about racial threat. A story about disobedience became a story about degeneration. A story about rescue became a story about cleansing intervention. These meanings were not written into the text as slogans. They were introduced through commentary, illustration, and contextualization. Illustrations in SS-approved and regime-aligned publications reinforced the message visually. Heroes appeared idealized, disciplined, and racially correct. Antagonists were distorted, animalistic, or marked as foreign. The visual language made ideological distinctions intuitive. Children did not need explanations. They recognized the pattern. The SS interest in folklore extended beyond Germany's borders. As the Reich expanded, Ahnenerbe researchers conducted expeditions across occupied Europe, collecting legends, songs, and stories. The stated purpose was comparative research. The practical outcome was cultural hierarchy. Germanic elements were identified and claimed as evidence of ancient influence. Local traditions were reframed as derivatives or corruptions of an original German source. In this way, folklore research supported imperial ideology. Fairy tales became geopolitical artifacts. They were used to justify domination, not only through force, but through heritage. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the SS had established itself as more than a security organization. It was a cultural authority. Its research institutions shaped how the past was imagined and how the future was justified. This authority rested on a dangerous premise, that culture could be reduced to essence, essence to blood, and blood to destiny. Fairy tales fit this logic perfectly. They appeared ancient. They appeared innocent. They appeared uncontested, which made them ideal carriers of meaning. What makes this process particularly effective is what it did not require. It did not require mass censorship. It did not require public debate. It did not require rewriting childhood from scratch. It required only that one interpretation be treated as natural and others as irrelevant. Once that happened, the work was largely done. Children raised within this framework did not experience indoctrination as intrusion. They experienced it as continuity, as tradition, as common sense. By the time they encountered explicit SS ideology, its assumptions already felt familiar. The involvement of the SS and the Ahnenerbe did not transform fairy tales overnight. It formalized a process that had already begun, the conversion of culture into infrastructure. Stories were no longer simply told. They were managed. They were analyzed for usefulness. They were aligned with policy. They were deployed in service of a worldview. And because they operated below the level of conscious belief, they were extraordinarily effective. This chapter marks a turning point. Up to this point, fairy tales had been claimed, interpreted, and emphasized. Now they were institutionalized, placed under the authority of organizations that treated culture as a strategic resource. In the next chapter, we will see the practical consequences of this system. How fairy tales appeared in classrooms, youth organizations, and visual propaganda. How abstract interpretations became everyday experience. And how stories that once warned children about danger were repurposed to teach them whom to fear, not as ideology, but as instinct. By the early 1940s, the Nazi project of cultural control had moved beyond interpretation and research. It had entered daily life. Fairy tales were no longer confined to bookshelves or academic commentary. They were embedded in classrooms, youth organizations, illustrated materials, and routines of upbringing. The stories did not announce ideology, but they carried it. The German school system played a central role in this process. After 1933, education was reorganized to serve the goals of National Socialism. Teachers were required to demonstrate ideological reliability, curricula were standardized, and teaching materials were reviewed for alignment with regime values. This did not mean that fairy tales were replaced with political texts. On the contrary, familiar cultural material was retained and reframed. Grimm fairy tales remained staples of early education. Their authority was not questioned. Their presence was not debated. What changed was how they were used. Stories were increasingly treated as moral case studies. Reading was followed by guided discussion, not about imagination or symbolism, but about correct behavior. Teachers were encouraged to emphasize obedience, discipline, and consequences. A child who strayed from the path was no longer simply unlucky. The child was irresponsible. The danger was not abstract. It was the predictable result of deviation. This framing aligned seamlessly with the broader educational goal of producing reliable members of the national community. Illustrations played an equally important role. In the 1930s and early 1940s, children's books in Germany were rarely text-only. Visual material carried as much meaning as narrative. Under Nazi cultural policy, illustration became a powerful tool for reinforcing ideological assumptions without words. Heroes in fairy tale illustrations increasingly appeared orderly, healthy, and idealized. They were depicted as physically correct, according to regime aesthetics. Symmetrical features, disciplined posture, clarity of expression. Antagonists, by contrast, were often exaggerated, distorted, or animalized. Even when the text remained unchanged, the image guided interpretation. A wolf was no longer just a predator. A witch was no longer just dangerous. They became visual signals of threat. Children did not need explanations. They learned to recognize danger instinctively. This visual logic extended beyond fairy tale books into educational posters, reading primers, and supplementary materials. The same aesthetic principles appeared repeatedly: order versus chaos, clarity versus distortion, belonging versus intrusion. Fairy tales in this environment functioned as training in perception. They taught children not only what to think, but how to see. Outside the classroom, youth organizations reinforced the same patterns. Membership in the Hitler Youth became compulsory by 1936, and the organization played a crucial role in shaping values through ritual, activity, and narrative. While fairy tales were not the primary content of Hitler Youth training, they formed part of the cultural background participants brought with them. Stories learned in childhood were echoed in songs, slogans, and symbolic activities. The idea of belonging to a community, defined by shared blood and destiny, felt familiar because it had already been rehearsed in narrative form. The forest, a recurring setting in fairy tales, became a central symbol in youth culture as well. Outdoor activities emphasized endurance, discipline, and connection to land. Nature was framed as both sacred and dangerous, something to be respected, mastered, and defended. This symbolic continuity mattered. It linked childhood imagination with adolescent identity formation. The Nazi regime understood that values reinforced across multiple domains. School, youth organizations, home, became difficult to dislodge. Fairy tales acted as a foundation layer. Later, ideological instruction built upon it. Importantly, this process did not require constant supervision. Parents continued reading familiar stories at home. Bedtime routines remained unchanged. The state did not need to intrude directly into the private sphere. The cultural material had already been standardized. That standardization was crucial. Once a single version of a story dominates, alternatives disappear from memory. Children raised on Grimm fairy tales in the 1930s rarely encountered earlier, harsher versions. They did not know that rescue was once absent, that ambiguity once existed, that moral outcomes were once less controlled. What they knew was order restored. The regime's emphasis on clarity extended to language itself. Fairy tales were valued for their simplicity. Complex psychological interpretation was discouraged. Stories were meant to be understood immediately, without debate. This preference reflected a broader Nazi suspicion of intellectualism. Ambiguity was associated with weakness. Analysis was associated with decay. The ideal citizen was not reflective, but instinctive. Fairy tales trained instinct. They taught that danger announces itself, that enemies are recognizable, that authority intervenes decisively, that survival depends on obedience. These lessons were not explicitly racial, but they were compatible with racial ideology. That compatibility was enough. By the late 1930s, fairy tales also appeared in regime-aligned magazines and cultural publications aimed at families. Articles emphasized their timeless wisdom and suitability for raising strong, disciplined children. Parents were encouraged to see traditional stories as safeguards against moral confusion and foreign influence. Once again, the message was indirect. The regime did not tell parents to indoctrinate their children. It told them to preserve tradition. The effect was the same. This system proved resilient during wartime. As Germany entered total war after 1939, childhood did not become less ideologically managed. It became more so. With fathers at the front and daily life increasingly militarized, stories provided stability. Familiar narratives reassured children that suffering had meaning and order would be restored. Fairy tales offered a world where hardship was temporary and justified, where enemies were punished and where endurance was rewarded. These themes mirrored wartime propaganda, but in a quieter register. What makes this phase particularly significant is how little overt violence it involved. No one was forced to read fairy tales. No one was punished for owning old editions. No laws mandated ideological interpretation at bedtime. The system worked because it did not appear coercive. Culture does not need force when it feels inherited. By embedding ideological patterns in early education and visual culture, the Nazi regime ensured that its worldview did not feel imposed. It felt remembered, rediscovered, returned. Fairy tales were not political texts. They were cultural scaffolding. They taught children how to understand authority before authority needed to explain itself. This chapter reveals the practical consequence of SS research and cultural appropriation. What began as interpretation became routine. What was once academic became instinctive. Stories left the realm of analysis and entered the realm of habit. In the next chapter, we will examine the psychological effect of this system more closely. How repeated exposure to these narrative patterns shaped perception, empathy, and moral judgment. And why, when ideology finally demanded action, so many experienced it not as rupture, but as continuation. By the time Nazi ideology demanded action, much of the psychological groundwork had already been laid. The transition from belief to behavior did not occur abruptly, nor did it require constant coercion. It followed a familiar path: repetition, normalization, and emotional conditioning. Fairy tales were not the cause of violence. They were part of the preparation that made violence intelligible. From early childhood, stories had taught clear narrative patterns. Danger came from deviation. Safety lay in obedience. Authority intervened decisively and restored order. Punishment was not cruelty, but necessity. These patterns did not need to be explained. They were absorbed through repetition, reinforced across settings, and confirmed visually and socially. Psychologically, this mattered. Children learn moral frameworks long before they can articulate them. Narrative is one of the earliest tools through which cause and consequence are understood. When stories consistently associate deviation with catastrophe and conformity with survival, they shape expectation. The world begins to feel structured in those terms. By the 1930s, German children encountered the same narrative logic across fairy tales, school instruction, youth organizations, and visual culture. The consistency reduced cognitive friction. There was no need to reconcile competing moral systems. The same lessons appeared everywhere. This produced a specific kind of moral intuition. Authority was not experienced as external pressure. It was experienced as protection. Obedience was not experienced as submission. It was experienced as common sense. Punishment was not experienced as injustice. It was experienced as restoration. These intuitions did not require ideological language to function. They were pre-ideological. As children grew older, this narrative conditioning shaped how new information was processed. Political messages that aligned with existing patterns felt immediately plausible. Messages that contradicted them felt confusing or threatening. When National Socialist ideology introduced explicit concepts of racial hierarchy, exclusion, and cleansing, it did not appear alien. It appeared familiar in structure. The language changed. The logic did not. Enemies were identified as disruptors of order. They were framed as deceptive, predatory, and dangerous. Community was defined as something fragile, requiring vigilance and defense. Violence was framed as intervention rather than aggression. This framing mirrored the moral structure already internalized through narrative. From a psychological perspective, this reduced resistance. People are more likely to accept actions that fit existing schemas of right and wrong. When violence is framed as necessary to restore order, it becomes easier to justify. When exclusion is framed as protection, it becomes easier to accept. Fairy tales did not teach children to hate specific groups. They taught children how to organize the world emotionally, who belongs, who threatens, and what must be done when order is disrupted. This conditioning also shaped empathy. Empathy is not distributed evenly. It is guided by perceived belonging. Narrative plays a central role in defining who counts as fully human within a story. In fairy tales, sympathy is directed toward protagonists who conform to accepted norms. Those who deviate or threaten the community are rarely afforded complexity. Their suffering is not dwelled upon. Their punishment is presented as deserved. Repeated exposure to such narratives trains selective empathy. When this pattern is extended beyond fiction into social reality, its effects are profound. People become more responsive to the suffering of those they recognize as part of their community, and less responsive to the suffering of those framed as outsiders. This does not require overt cruelty. It requires emotional distance. The Nazi system cultivated that distance carefully. As ideological language intensified in the late 1930s and early 1940s, calls for exclusion and violence did not always provoke shock. For many, they resonated with an already familiar moral structure. The idea that danger must be eliminated to protect the community felt consistent with earlier lessons. This consistency mattered more than persuasion. Another psychological effect of narrative conditioning was the reduction of moral ambiguity. Fairy tales, especially in their standardized forms, offered clear outcomes. Actions led predictably to consequences. Complexity was minimized. Doubt was unnecessary. This encouraged a form of moral certainty. In such a framework, hesitation appears as weakness. Questioning appears as disobedience. Compassion toward perceived enemies appears as betrayal. When the world is understood through simplified moral narratives, complex ethical situations become difficult to process. The Nazi regime exploited this tendency by framing political decisions as moral imperatives rather than policy choices. It reduced space for deliberation. Actions were presented as necessary responses to clear threats. The language of destiny replaced the language of responsibility. For individuals conditioned to expect decisive resolution, this framing was psychologically reassuring. It reduced anxiety. Importantly, this process did not eliminate personal agency. People were not automatons, but it did shape the range of responses that felt emotionally acceptable. Resistance required not only courage, but the ability to tolerate moral ambiguity and uncertainty. For those raised within a narrative environment that discouraged ambiguity, such tolerance was difficult. This helps explain why so many participated in or accommodated systems of exclusion without perceiving themselves as cruel. They understood their actions within a framework that prioritized order over compassion and necessity over doubt. They were not acting against their moral instincts. They were acting through them. The transition from narrative conditioning to active participation was gradual. It occurred through everyday decisions rather than dramatic moments. Compliance with discriminatory laws, silence in the face of exclusion, acceptance of escalating measures framed as security. Each step felt small. Each step felt justified. Narrative conditioning does not produce sudden violence. It produces normalization. It shifts the baseline of what feels acceptable. Once that baseline moves, actions that once seemed unthinkable can begin to feel inevitable. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of cultural conditioning. It operates below conscious awareness. People may believe they are making independent choices while following patterns that have long been internalized. The psychological impact of this system became most visible during the war. As violence intensified and moral stakes increased, the narrative frameworks learned in childhood provided a sense of coherence. Suffering was framed as sacrifice. Death was framed as necessity. Loss was framed as destiny. Fairy tale logic offered emotional containment. In stories, hardship is temporary. Evil is punished. Order is restored. This structure can be comforting in times of crisis. But when applied to real-world violence, it can also justify prolonged suffering by framing it as meaningful. The Nazi regime consistently exploited this tendency. It presented war not as a series of contingent decisions, but as a moral trial with predetermined outcomes. Endurance became virtue. Questioning became weakness. Narrative conditioning made this framing easier to accept. It is important to understand what this chapter does not claim. It does not claim that fairy tales cause genocide. It does not claim that stories alone produce violence. Human behavior is shaped by many factors: ideology, fear, opportunism, coercion, and circumstance. What this chapter shows is how narrative environments shape moral perception. They influence what feels normal, what feels justified, what feels necessary. When those perceptions align with an ideology that demands exclusion and violence, resistance becomes harder. Not because people are incapable of moral judgment, but because their judgment operates within a narrowed emotional range. The effectiveness of the Nazi system lay in its integration. Stories, education, visual culture, and ideology reinforced one another. No single element was decisive. Together, they created an environment in which certain responses felt natural and others felt unthinkable. This environment did not disappear overnight in 1945. Narrative conditioning leaves traces. It shapes memory, expectation, and emotional reflex long after the political system that produced it collapses. This is one reason post-war societies struggled to confront the moral implications of everyday participation. It is easier to condemn ideology than to examine the stories that made it feel plausible. This chapter marks the culmination of the process we have traced so far. Fairy tales move from folklore to canon, from canon to ideology, from ideology to psychology. They did not dictate actions. They shaped the emotional logic through which actions were understood. In the final chapter, we will examine what happened after the collapse of the Third Reich, how these stories were rehabilitated, sanitized, and returned to cultural life, and why the question of their wartime role was largely set aside, because the most enduring effects of cultural conditioning are often the least visible. They remain embedded in what feels familiar. And familiarity, more than force, is what allows power to endure. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, its symbols were dismantled with remarkable speed. Flags were removed, uniforms disappeared, institutions were dissolved, trials were held. The language of ideology was publicly discredited. National Socialism was declared a crime, an aberration, a rupture in history. But culture does not collapse the way regimes do. Fairy tales survived the war intact. They remained on shelves. They remained in schools. They remained in homes. Their covers changed. Their illustrations softened. Their ideological framing faded quietly from view. The stories themselves, however, were never placed on trial. There were no denazification hearings for fairy tales. This was not an oversight. It was a choice shaped by necessity. Post-war Germany faced the task of reconstruction, physical, political, and moral. Cultural continuity offered stability in a landscape of ruin. Familiar stories helped restore a sense of normalcy, especially for children growing up among destruction and loss. Questioning those stories would have meant questioning childhood itself. That question was largely avoided. Instead, fairy tales were reclassified once again. They returned to the category they had occupied before ideology claimed them: harmless tradition, moral stories, children's literature. The uncomfortable fact that they had functioned smoothly within a system of mass violence was rarely addressed. The assumption was simple and reassuring. Stories are neutral. Politics corrupted them. Once politics was removed, innocence returned. History suggests otherwise. What the Nazi period revealed was not that fairy tales were dangerous, but that they were effective. Effective because they were trusted. Effective because they were familiar. Effective because they operated below the level of conscious belief. After 1945, this effectiveness became difficult to confront. To acknowledge it would have required a deeper reckoning, not only with ideology, but with culture itself, with the realization that systems of violence do not rely solely on propaganda or terror, but on narratives that shape moral intuition long before political language appears. Such a reckoning would have raised uncomfortable questions about how moral certainty is formed, about how obedience becomes virtue, about how exclusion can feel like order. Those questions were postponed. In the decades that followed, the fairy tales of the brothers Grimm were restored to their place as cultural heritage. Scholarly attention returned to their origins, their sources, and their literary value. New editions appeared. New interpretations emerged. The stories continued to be told, translated, and adapted. What largely disappeared from discussion was their role within the cultural machinery of the Third Reich. Not because it was unknown, but because it did not fit comfortably into a narrative of rupture. It is easier to draw a clear line between before and after when discussing laws, uniforms, and institutions. It is harder to do so with stories that move seamlessly across political systems. Fairy tales do not announce when they change function. They simply continue. This history does not suggest that fairy tales should be censored, rejected, or feared. It suggests something more demanding. That culture must be understood as active, not decorative. Stories do not merely reflect values. They help produce them. They shape emotional logic. They define what feels normal, justified, or inevitable. When such narratives align with a system of power, they can reinforce it without appearing to participate. This is what made fairy tales so valuable to National Socialism. They did not persuade. They prepared. They did not instruct. They normalized. They did not command. They made commands feel familiar. The lesson of this history is not confined to Germany or to the 20th century. Every society inherits stories it does not question. Every generation absorbs narratives before it learns to analyze them. These narratives shape perception long before ideology appears. Power does not always need to speak loudly. Sometimes it only needs to decide which stories remain and which quietly disappear. After the war, Germany rebuilt its institutions, confronted its crimes, and rejected its ideology. What it did not fully confront was how easily culture had been mobilized and how smoothly it had functioned. That silence was not accidental. It was comfortable. But comfort is not the same as understanding. This story began with a familiar fairy tale and followed it into places it was never meant to go. Not because the tale changed, but because the world around it did and recognized its usefulness. The Nazis did not invent new myths. They inherited old ones, already disciplined, already trusted, already normalized. And they understood something essential. When a story feels ancient, it feels true. When it feels true, it feels unquestionable. And when it is unquestionable, it can carry almost anything, including violence. That is why this story does not end in 1945. Because stories do not end when regimes fall. They remain, waiting to be read, interpreted, and used again. The question is never whether stories matter. The question is who decides how they are told, and to whom.